On the 22nd of January 2006, Kobe Bryant walked off a basketball court having scored 81 points in a single game, the second highest individual total in professional NBA history. For years, the story told about that night followed a familiar shape. Kobe locked in, Kobe took over. Kobe dragged his team back from 18 points down through sheer competitive force of will. What researchers who study flow state and peak performance now suggest is that story is incomplete in a way that changes everything. What the neuroscience of peak performance actually suggests is that what happened to Bryant that night wasn't produced by trying harder. It was, in all likelihood, the direct result of his brain doing something closer to the opposite. Here's what the game actually looked like. The Lakers trailed Toronto at halftime, 63-49, and Bryant had 26 points, which is a solid half of basketball, but not a signal of anything historic. Then the third quarter began. He scored 27 points in it, then 28 in the fourth. 55 second-half points in total, accounting for all but 18 of his team's scoring after the break. He converted 18 of 20 free throws. Across the entire game, he committed just 3 turnovers. The efficiency, at that volume and under that pressure, borders on statistically surreal, and it raises an obvious question. What was actually happening inside his brain? Bryant himself pointed toward an answer, and his phrasing was more precise than most sports commentary that followed. He described the experience not in terms of effort, but in terms of balance. It's a very tough balance because any moment can take you out of that zone, that flow where nothing else matters. He was describing with unusual accuracy a psychological state that a Hungarian-American researcher named Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi had spent decades trying to document and define. Csikszentmihalyi began his research in the 1970s, watching painters, chess players, and surgeons, people so absorbed in what they were doing that they routinely ignored hunger, fatigue, and the passage of time. Across cultures and professions, they described the experience in nearly identical terms: complete concentration, clear goals, instant feedback, a feeling of effortlessness, and a loss of the sense of self. By the time his formal account appeared in 1990, he had gathered data from more than 100,000 participants worldwide. He called the state flow, and one of its most consistent features, that disappearance of self-consciousness, turns out to point directly toward what the brain appears to be doing during it. Which brings us to the part nobody expected. In 2003, neuroscientist Arne Dietrich proposed what became known as the Transient Hypofrontality hypothesis. During intense, highly practiced activity, he argued, the brain temporarily reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for self-monitoring, second-guessing, working memory, and analytical deliberation. By freeing up the metabolic resources those processes consume, the brain allows faster, more automatic, and more integrated systems to operate without interference from the conscious mind. EEG research has since recorded measurable drops in beta wave activity over frontal electrode positions during high-flow states, which is consistent with that account. Building on earlier fMRI, work by Charles Lim at Johns Hopkins, who used brain imaging to study jazz musicians in live improvisation, a 2024 study from Drexel University added more texture to the picture. Researchers recorded 32 jazz guitarists across 192 improvisations and found that high flow performance was associated with greater left hemisphere activity alongside reduced frontal and default mode network activity. Their conclusion pointed to 2 simultaneous requirements: extensive domain-specific experience that builds a specialized neural network, and an active releasing of conscious control once that experience is in place. One without the other appears insufficient. Put Bryant back in that frame. 17 years into his professional career, built on a training history that his coaches described as genuinely extreme, the kind of deliberate practice that researchers like Anders Ericsson argued builds the deeply embedded skill that automatic performance depends on. And then, in the second half against Toronto, something shifted. The analytical override came down, and the shooting became what neuroscientists call procedural automaticity, the most literal neurological sense of the word automatic. Here is where the science gets more complicated, though. The transient hypofrontality account has been challenged by very recent research using metastable dynamics analysis, which found that flow does not resemble a brain simply switching off a single region. It looks more like a whole brain coordination event with high-dimensional dynamic state transitions moving across multiple networks at once. A 2021 theoretical review in Frontiers in Psychology had already proposed 4 neural systems likely involved: the basal ganglia reward network, where dopamine-driven reward circuits reinforce skilled performance in real time, the locus coeruleus system governing task engagement, the central executive network, and the salience network, which determines what earns the brain's attention in the first place, anchored in part by the anterior cingulate cortex. These systems do not appear to operate in sequence. Researchers believe they operate together, and that flow is what emerges when they align. Flow, on that account, is not a simple off switch. It's a coordination problem the brain solves for you when the conditions are right, and that distinction matters because it reframes what practice is actually for. It's not just building skill, it's building the neural architecture that flow can run on. There is an honest limit worth naming here. The neuroscience of flow is, by the researchers' own admission, only beginning to develop. There are roughly 50 years of psychological data on the state, and a fraction of that in controlled neural studies. The metastable dynamics findings are very recent and have not yet been replicated. The field is still working out what flow actually is at the level of brain function, which means the details will almost certainly keep shifting. One detail about that night tends to get overlooked entirely. Bryant's grandmother was in the arena, attending the first and only professional game of his career she ever watched in person. He wasn't performing for a national television audience chasing the moment in real time. Most of the US sporting media had its attention elsewhere that evening, absorbed by the NFL Conference Championships. And Bryant had already demonstrated, 5 weeks earlier, that he could enter this state and choose not to extend it. Against Dallas in December, he had outscored the entire opposing team by himself through 3 quarters, then sat out the 4th when Phil Jackson rested him. He had been there before and hadn't chased the number. Csikszentmihalyi's research uncovered a paradox that kept reappearing in his data. People in flow reported the highest levels of engagement and well-being of any activity in their lives, higher than leisure, higher than socializing, higher than almost anything else they measured. And yet, when given a free choice, they consistently chose passive leisure over the conditions that produced flow. People prefer the idea of peak performance to the disciplines and circumstances that actually make it possible. Which, if you think about it, is a fairly accurate description of how most people approach training. Bryant, whatever you make of the rest of his story, had structured a professional life around those disciplines with unusual consistency. The flow didn't arrive despite the work. It arrived because of it, and then it arrived fully only when he stopped consciously managing what the work had built. That is the counterintuitive finding the research keeps returning to. You cannot force your way into flow. The prefrontal cortex running active self-monitoring oversight, which feels from the inside like focus and control, appears to be precisely the mechanism that blocks it. The brain's analytical systems, when they stay switched on during a highly practiced performance, consume the resources the automatic systems need to operate cleanly. 81 points. Not because he tried harder after halftime, because at some point in that third quarter, something in his brain stopped trying to supervise itself at all. If the science behind how the brain builds the kind of automatic, deeply embedded skill that makes flow accessible in the first place interests you, that is exactly the territory this channel covers, and it is where we're headed next.